right, so let's talk a little bit about business cycles, unemployment, and inflation. Okay, so phases of the business cycle is we have the peak, and that is when the economy is at its high. Basically, what we're assuming is that the economy is near or at full employment. Um, Basically, everyone that is able to work is working, and the only type of unemployment that exists is frictional unemployment, and that's people that are just leaving one job to find a job that better suits their skills. It's not long-term unemployment. A recession is when GDP declines 2 quarters in a row. So if GDP declines for 6 months in a row, then we are technically in a recession. The trough is the bottoming out of the recession. It's when the economy has hit its lowest point within a given time period. It can be, the economy can stay at the trough for just a little bit of time, a moderate amount of time, or an extended period of time. So if they say it's like a V-shaped recession, okay, let me get my. Then it quickly goes down. We have the trough over here, but then the economy quickly bounces back. A U-shaped recession would be, the economy hits its trough, stays there, 3 to 6 months, comes back up, and then we have the L-shaped recession, which the economy kind of basically bottoms out and then stays flat for a long period of time. A lot of economists will say that Japan had that type of recession back in the lost decade, and this was a time period from 91 to 2000, where Japan's economy collapsed and then didn't grow for 10 years. But however, now it's been extended from 2001 to 2010 as well. So really, it's the lost 2 decades. Basically, real wages have failed to grow. GDP hasn't really grown either. And so, Japan's looking at different policies to help increase their growth. And expansion is when the economy is growing. Okay, so we can see this is what the economy looks like, and its fluctuations, and they're normal. I mean, every economy goes through this. We're not always going to be in a growth cycle, but we're not always going to be stagnant either, or in a recession. Okay. Now, it's not always regular. I mean, it's not, we have growth for 2 years and then a recession for 3 months, and then growth for 2 years, a recession for 3 months. I mean, sometimes we go for many years before we hit a recession, such as the majority of the 90s, we were in a growth stage. So there's different factors that affect it, and it's not regular. Economic fluctuations are very irregular. Okay, so we can see some of the recessions here since the 50s, and what we find is that, okay, as GDP declines, okay, which is over here, okay, for example, the recession between 53-54, output declined by 2.6%, GDP, in other words, declined by 2.6%. Unemployment goes up. Why? Because if companies are not producing so much, if there's a drop in production, we don't need as many workers, so workers get laid off, businesses fold since there's not enough demand for their product, and unemployment goes up. So what we do see is with declining output, unemployment rate goes up, and then with increasing output, unemployment rate goes down. Okay, so we can see that in 73, 75, we had a pretty long recession there. Okay, same with 81 to 82, and the longest recession was the most recent one from 2007, 2009. I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is 18 months over here. And output declined by 3.7%, which is significant. That is why it's called the Great Recession. It is the biggest downturn since the Great Depression. Also, I'd just like to point out here that you could see that sometimes we have two recessions close to each other. If you look at 80 and then 81, 82, those are called double dip recessions. And then other times you go a long time period without a recession. As you can see, from once we got out of the recession in 91, we didn't have one again until 2001. So we had 10 years of growth before we hit another downturn. A lot of these fluctuations happen because there's been an economic shock. Essentially what an economic shock is an unexpected event that individuals and firms have some trouble adjusting to, especially in the short run. It's easier to adjust in the long run than it is in the short run. And also in the short run, prices are sticky. We don't, companies, businesses, they don't rapidly adjust their prices. So, they plan prices ahead of time, and they charge a certain price for their product. But let's say we have a negative economic shock and there's not as much demand for their product, due to various factors, what normally happens is the economic response is that there is a decrease in output first, and also that there are layoffs, and then eventually prices may go downward. There's a lot of resistance against it because people normally say, okay, well, if prices are going down, that's great. But the one problem is that if prices of goods and services are continuously going down, eventually wages will go down too. And no one likes their wage to go down. So in the short run, prices are sticky. They don't adjust right away. And so companies produce less and also lay off workers. And then also if there's a positive economic shock, it would be the other way. Production increases more and companies hire more workers. All right, so what are some of these causes of economic shocks? Irregular innovation. So, when, for example, the computer and the internet, took off, there was great growth. And then once the market became saturated with computers and the internet, growth had slowed down a bit. Also, productivity changes. Hopefully productivity is always going up, especially when it comes to technology. But sometimes it's, natural resources get hit. Oil gets hit and increases. And when oil goes up, then the cost of transportation for companies to transport their goods and services, the cost for consumers to fill up their cars, etc., increases. And so normally that will cause productivity to slow down a little bit. Or if, due to bad weather, a lot of the crops get knocked out, once again, that will cause a decrease in productivity. Monetary factors, this could be, the central bank floods the market with money, so interest rates interest rates drop. Okay, interest rates drop. Companies see this as a great time to buy capital goods to expand their businesses, and also households see it as a great time to buy a house since interest rates are low. And so economic activity builds up via investment, for example, and that can happen very rapidly, and that's a positive economic shock. Or it could be the other way around, where the Fed decreases the money supply and increases interest rates, and then we have a slowdown of the housing market and also firms buying capital goods. Political events, of course, during an election year, things are a little bit more shaky. Companies don't know which president will be elected and what policies will affect them. So sometimes they tend to hold off on investment. Also, any type of unfortunate terrorist attack, that shakes up the economy as well. And then financial instability. So, the dot-com bubble, what happened is, we had this flood of companies. They all wanted to get in the dot-com sector, and a lot of shareholders bought these companies' stock thinking that all these companies were going to make it big. And essentially, it led to what we call bubbles. And bubbles occur when investors buy more of that asset thinking that the asset price will continue to increase, but in fact, and which leads to the asset being overvalued, and eventually the bubble bursts and the asset goes to being valued what it really should be, and people lose a lot of money. You can definitely attribute the recession of 2007 to the housing bubble. A lot of subprime mortgages were being given, and these people were buying extremely overvalued houses with low incomes. And so when people started to default on their payments at a rapid pace, it wasn't just one or two people defaulting on their payments. It was a lot of people defaulting on their payments. The value of their housing came crashing down as well. If you want to see a good presentation, it's a short presentation, but it gives a great summary. You can go to, for the 2007 recession, you can go to crisisofcredit.com, and it gives you a great about 10-minute presentation of the recession of 2007 and its causes. What's impacted the most? For sure, capital goods and consumer durables during economic fluctuations. So during recessions, companies hold back on expanding their operations. They don't want to expand their operations, produce more output if there's not going to be demand for it. So they pull back. Investment is definitely the most volatile component of GDP. But also when the economy is expanding, companies tend to put a lot into investment, a lot of resources into investment. If there's going to be increasing demand for the good, they want to make sure they can handle and provide that output for the demand. Consumer durables, again, consumer durables are goods that are built to last 3 years or more. So, during a recession, a family may hold off on buying new furniture, a new car. Okay, they'll try to extend what they have. But during times of expansion, they tend to buy more cars, more furniture, etc. Non-durable goods are affected less. We need to eat, we need to have some clothes. So, they don't fluctuate as much as consumer durable goods, and also services. We still need to go to the doctor, for example, go to the dentist, get our hair cut. So, non-durable consumer goods tend to be affected less during times of expansion and recession. All right, moving on to the unemployment rate. Okay, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the agency that computes the unemployment rate. They update it monthly, and they do it like a national unemployment rate, but also statewide, and even by city. So you can look up, if you go to bls.gov, you can find the unemployment rate for Houston, for San Francisco, for example, for New York City. You can find all sorts of statistics in there. They conduct surveys each month. They ask about 60,000 people questions, and that's how they determine the unemployment rates and other statistics. All right, so there's 3 categories here. Okay, so we have the under 16, and or institutionalized. Okay, these people are not able to work because they're either not of the age to work, or they're in jail, or they are in mental hospitals. Then we have not in the labor force, and these are people that can work, but they choose not to. This could be your full-time student. This could be your stay-at-home mom. This could just be someone that maybe inherited a lot of money and just doesn't want to work. Okay, if a person is 16 or older and they're not in some type of institution, but they're not actively seeking work, okay, they are not in the labor force. Then we have people who are employed, so about 50% of the labor force, 50% of the population is employed. And then we have unemployed. So the difference between unemployed people and not in the labor force is that unemployed people are actively seeking work. Whereas not in the labor force, those people are not seeking work. They're not applying for jobs. Okay, so the labor force, okay, is employed plus unemployed. That is the labor force over here. Okay, so the unemployment rate is very simply the number of unemployed people, which would be 12.5 million, divided by the labor force, okay, which is 155 million. Okay, remember, labor force is unemployed plus employed times 100. And so we see here that the unemployment rate for 2012 was 8%. All right, so there are some criticisms of the unemployment rate, and if you were to just take it at face value, you wouldn't see this, but you can go under bls.gov and look up these actual statistics themselves to gain a more accurate picture. So first is that involuntary part-time workers are counted as full-time. What is an involuntary part-time worker? That is a person who wants to work full-time, is not able to find full-time work, so they are working part-time. However, the BLS in their overall calculation counts part-time workers and full-time workers the same. They don't make that distinction in the unemployment rate. Now, you can go on their website and look at how many people are working part-time because they want to, how many people are working part-time but want to be working full-time, etc. Also, discouraged workers. Now, discouraged workers are people that want to work, have been looking for work for a long time, have not been able to find work, become discouraged, and stop looking for work. Usually it's temporary, but since they are actively not seeking work, they are technically not in the labor force category. Again, we don't count them as unemployed because unemployed persons are actively seeking work. Once they are no longer actively seeking work, then they go back to being not in the labor force. And so, if you were to go to bls.gov and look at starting with the Great Recession in 2007, month after month, the number of discouraged workers rose rapidly. And so economists were to say, well, if you were to include the discouraged workers and the unemployment rate, then unemployment rate would be much higher. And since we don't, it's understated. So a couple things to look out from. So sometimes the unemployment rate will fall, but it's not because we're actually gaining jobs. It's because there's been an increase in people dropping out of the labor force, which makes the unemployment rate go down. All right. So frictional unemployment is usually short term. This is people that, left one job, they're trying to find another job that better suits their skills, or they're waiting to take a job offer. It's just that short-term period in between jobs. Structural unemployment is longer term, and this happens when there's been a change in the economy, the composition of sectors. So for example, over time we see that agriculture has declined. And so those workers that had jobs in agriculture are then we call displaced workers. Their skills are no longer needed, and so their unemployment periods are longer until they can either gain new skills or just find something else. Also, with a lot of jobs being moved offshore, or machines replacing workers, once again, those workers are displaced. They have skill set that is no longer relevant, or not some. It's just not useful in the United States anymore. There's not enough jobs for what they do, and so until they find something else or they get retrained, they remain unemployed for long periods of time. Actually, community colleges are a great site for training programs. A lot of displaced workers go back to community college. There's a lot of programs to help workers learn new skills, and that way they are marketable again to companies. And then cyclical unemployment. This is caused when the economy is in a recession. The economy declines, output declines, and so unemployment will rise. So cyclical unemployment arises from the economy declining, or essentially being in a recession. Okay, so we have the natural rate of unemployment. This is the rate that there is full employment. Okay, so what exactly is full employment? Full employment is when the economy is only existing some type of frictional and structural unemployment. Those are unavoidable, but that there is no cyclical unemployment. Okay, so the economy is pretty much fully employed. What's causing the unemployment rate is some structural, just because the economy is always changing, and then some frictional because people are, changing jobs. The natural rate of unemployment is usually somewhere around 5.5%, but it does change due to demographic changes, public policy changes, and also job search methods have been changing as well. So that can vary the natural rate of unemployment. So actual unemployment can be above, which is not desirable, or below the natural rate of unemployment. Being below would be desirable. There's an economic cost to this. Okay, so there's a GDP gap. There's actual GDP minus potential GDP. Now, this can be a positive number or it can be a negative number. So in the case where, if unemployment is above the natural rate, as it was during the years of the Great Recession, okay, then it will be negative because GDP will fall short of its potential. The potential would be, if the economy was at the natural rate of unemployment, but since the actual rate of unemployment was higher than the natural rate, then GDP is below its potential. Now, if the unemployment rate is below its natural rate, the economy is just booming as it was in the 90s, then the GDP cap can be negative. Then actual GDP is greater than potential GDP, which is based on the natural rate of unemployment. So if the actual unemployment rate, let's say, is 4% and the natural rate is 5.5%, then the GDP gap will be positive because actual GDP is greater than its potential GDP. Okay, so Arthur Oken came up with what is known as Oken's law, and essentially is every 1% of cyclical unemployment, creates a 2% GDP gap. So, and going by the calculation in the book, in 2009, the unemployment rate was 9.3%. That the natural rate was 5%, so that was 4.3% above the natural rate. So if we multiply this by 2, we get 8.6% impact in terms of loss of GDP, which translated to 1.2 trillion. So it's quite significant. I mean, there's a lot of reasons and motivations why why the government would want to implement policy to help decrease the unemployment rate. Okay, so we can see in the 90s over here, okay, GDP gap was positive. So, potential GDP was in the red, actual GDP is in the blue. So we can see here that we were producing, actual GDP was greater than potential GDP. And then we can see here in the Great Recession, just the amount of impact the Great Recession had. I mean, that's quite significant, where actual GDP was much lower than potential GDP. I mean, we could see some of the recessions here and slow growth in the earlier 90s, but it's nothing compared to what we saw in the Great Recession of '07. All right, and we can see the unemployment rate over time. It dropped to its low right before the dot-com bubble burst over here, about 4%, which is excellent. That is below, unemployment here was below the natural rate. And we could see with the Great Recession, it hit just 10%. And it's been dropping, and today it sits at about 5.5%. In the long run, unemployment always returns to the natural rate. Okay, and with changes in the unemployment rate, it doesn't affect every age group, race, ethnicity, gender, education group equally at all. And here, we can see here. So, for example, managerial and professional positions, from when the recession hit in '07, what began in '07, and we felt more of the effects in '09. They were hit a little bit. I mean, for sure, their unemployment rate more than doubled, but not as much as, for example, the unemployment rate for construction workers, which was 7.6%, and then it jumped to 19.7%. Okay. Also, if you look at over here, age groups, okay, the younger age group from 16 and 19% was hit much harder than age groups for people that were 20 or older. And as well, African American teens were hit harder than white teens were. In general, we saw almost every race here, their unemployment rate doubled, but you can see how African American, Hispanic had a much higher unemployment rate than whites did. Men were hit harder as well. So it's not, whenever we have a recession, it doesn't hit everyone the same. Some age groups, some genders, some professions, etc., are hit harder than others. And of course, if you need any type of justification for higher education, we saw that the unemployment rate for people with a college degree, even though it more than doubled, it still was pretty low compared to people with just a high school diploma or less than a high school diploma. All right, and so there's, non-economic costs to high unemployment, being unemployed. Long-term unemployment is very hard on people. They tend to become obsolete in their skills, and even employers, when they see someone has been out of work for a while, is a little bit more hesitant to hire them. They don't know how updated they are. Of course, there's depression, feeling down. It might cause family problems. I mean, definitely, living in poverty, having financial difficulties is hard on a family and does create a lot of stress. Also, if one racial group has a higher unemployment than another racial group. Studies have found that, it will cause some racial and ethnic tensions. It causes illness, unfortunately, suicide, just a lot of um, um, negative effects of being unemployed. And also, we find that societies that have very high unemployment rate tend to be more violent as well, and use drugs more. Okay, so from 2002 to 2012 over here, you could see the unemployment rates for Germany, France, Italy, U.S., and Japan. So the Great Recession here impacted all countries except for Germany. Okay, Germany continued to be an economic powerhouse during this time period. All right, moving on to inflation. Okay, inflation is the overall rise in prices. It reduces the power of a dollar. In other words, the purchasing power of money. So you might remember, your grandparents or even your parents might say, "Oh, well, milk used to be 50 cents a gallon, and now milk is $4 a gallon." And so, with the increase in the price of milk, before your dollar could buy 2 gallons of milk, and now your dollar can only buy a quarter of a gallon of milk. But inflation is not always a bad thing. As long as wages can keep up, then, inflation is a byproduct of a growing economy. So it's inevitable. It will occur as the economy grows. The important thing is that wages also keep up as well. The government uses this consumer price index to measure inflation. Once again, this is conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS. And so they, track it monthly as well. And what they do is, they take the price of a basket in the most recent year and divide it by the price of the basket in a base year. So right now, 82 to 84, and times it by 100, and they get a 3-digit number called the CPI. Okay, and then what they'll do is the CPI of the most current year minus CPI of the base year divided by CPI of the base year times 100, and they will get the inflation rate. So in this example, okay, we have the CPI for 2006 and 2007. So the CPI in 2007 was 207.3, and in 2006 it was 201.6. So this will be, the newer year, 2007, so 207.3 minus the older year, the base year here, 2006, so 201.6 divided by 201.6 times 100. So inflation from 06 to 07 was 2.8%. It's rare that we actually have a negative inflation rate. This would be called deflation. It did occur from 08 to 09 during the Great Recession, when there was, such a lack of demand for goods and services, and cut back on production, that prices actually did fall. But normally prices are going up. Okay. So we have inflation rates for U.S., Italy, France, Germany, and Japan over here. So we can see that essentially the Great Recession did slow down production and demand, and so inflation also fell, but then growth picked back up again. And we can see that once again, it's a byproduct of growth. There will be inflation as people demand more goods and services. During times of economic expansion, the price of those goods and services will increase. Also, sometimes input costs rise, and inputs are what firms use to make the output, and so as those rise, the cost of their goods will rise as well. Okay, so we see here, in the 70s, we had two periods of very high inflation. This was attributed to a number of factors, but there was a negative supply shock with oil and also some bad Federal Reserve policy as well. Okay, the two types of inflation, there's demand pull inflation. This is when it's described as too many dollars chasing too few goods. It's when usually this occurs during an economy that is growing and experiencing great expansion, and as demand for goods and services go up rapidly, firms cannot quite keep up, so there's not quite enough supply for the demand, and so prices go up to help bring the economy back in equilibrium as well. Also, when central banks print too much money as well, interest rates tend to drop, and so businesses will spend more money on capital goods. Households will buy more houses, or since the interest rates are low, there's not as much of an incentive for households to save their money, so instead they purchase items. There's also inflation called cost push inflation, and this is due to supply shocks and a rise in input costs as well. So whenever the price of oil goes up, we call that a negative supply shock. It increases the cost of businesses because the cost of transporting their goods and services goes up, which leads to higher prices for their goods and services. In reality, it is sometimes hard to distinguish between these inflation types. Sometimes they occur at the same time. The economy could be growing, consumers could be demanding more goods and services. In order to supply the goods and services, firms demand more resources, and then the cost of those resources go up. Cost of, for example, oil might go up because of it, and that will create some cost push inflation as well. So it's not always easy to tell, which one is at play, or if they're both at play. Also, cost push inflation usually ends in a recession, as it costs companies a lot more money to produce their good. What normally happens is they lower their output, since demand will drop due to the higher price of the good, and then they will start laying off people, and this will all lead to a recession. Demand pull inflation will continue as long as households continue their excess spending. Then it will continue until spending slows down. Let's talk a little bit about core inflation. Look at this. CPI does not include food and energy prices. Why? Because food and energy prices can be very volatile. 1 month they'll go up, the next month they'll go down. And so what policymakers want to look at is this, the underlying rate of inflation that is more stable, just because food and energy prices can be all over the place, and it can paint a different picture than what's going on in the rest of the economy with the goods and services. Okay, anytime we have a nominal or a real variable, in this case it's nominal income and real income, but it could be nominal interest rate, real interest rate, etc. The real variable has been adjusted for inflation, whereas the nominal variable has not been adjusted for inflation. So your nominal income, for example, will be your salary. Let's say you earn $50,000 a year. Your real income has been adjusted for inflation. So what we're looking at is the purchasing power of your income. So you might earn $50,000, But what can you buy with that $50,000? If your salary stays the same year after year, but prices keep rising year after year, then your real income goes down because your $50,000 can buy less year after year with inflation occurring than prior years. So, if I make $50,000 a year and what I buy, let's say, is $47,000 worth of food, clothes, etc. Let's say the next year, that same basket of goods and services that I buy due to inflation is 50,000. Okay, so even though I'm making the same, due to inflation, the same amount of goods and services that I'm buying is now more expensive. So either I'm left with no income, or I will have to reduce how much I buy since I can buy less of them. If you look at the formula on the bottom, we have percentage change in real income equals the percentage change in your nominal income, basically how much did your salary change percent-wise, minus a percentage change in the price level. Okay, if your nominal income changes by more than the percent change in the price level, then your real income will grow. However, if it changes less than the percentage change in the price level, then your real income will drop. So let's say you get a 10% raise, so now you're making $55,000. Okay, but inflation has been 15%. Okay, your real income then drops by -5%. Yes, in dollar terms, you're making more money, but in purchasing power terms, okay, your real income has dropped because you can't buy as much this year as you could last year because inflation was higher than your percentage change in nominal income. All right, so there's anticipated and unanticipated effects of inflation. Okay, so unanticipated inflation, this is when inflation is, for example, higher than what people anticipated. And fixed income receivers, their real incomes fall. These are people who receive the same amount of income year after year. And so when inflation is higher than expected, let's say inflation was 5%, and anticipated inflation was 2%, so the fixed income receiver received a 2% increase in their income, but inflation was actually 5%, then the real income will fall. Also savers, okay? I mean, you save $1,000 in the bank, but let's say your interest rate is, again, based on anticipated inflation 2%, but actual inflation is 5%, and the value of your dollars in your bank have dropped in terms of purchasing power. And also creditors. So you loan someone, let's say, $1,000, and that next, let's say for 2 years, and then when it comes time to pay it back, there's been 7% inflation during that time. So when you get paid back that $1,000, it's not worth as much now than it was before. Even if, let's say, you charge 2% interest based on anticipated inflation, but inflation was actually 7%, for example, the dollars that you were paid back are not going to be worth as much. Okay, who is not as affected by unanticipated inflation? People whose incomes are tied to the consumer price index. Okay, so automatically, if the CPI goes up by 5%, their income goes up by 5%. It's not based on anticipated inflation, but rather it goes up along with the CPI. Then they're not hurt if inflation is higher than expected, because their incomes will change along with it. Also, debtors. So if you were the person taking out the loan, and let's say you took out $1,000 loan based on, you have to pay 2% interest, but actual interest was 7%, so you got a 7% raise. So it'll be easier for you to pay back the loan. The dollars are cheaper since you're making more money essentially than expected. And we do try to have an anticipated inflation rate. That way the effects of inflation are not so severe and volatile. So, when you take a loan from the bank and they charge you a certain amount of interest, it's based on an expected level of inflation, or when you get a pay increase, some cost of living adjustment should be automatically included in that, due to, expected inflation. Oftentimes, banks will charge you a nominal interest rate, and that will be, a real interest rate, and plus a certain level of expected inflation. Okay, so nominal interest rate will be the real interest rate plus inflation. Real interest rate is nominal interest rate minus inflation. Once again, the difference between nominal and real variables is that real variables have been adjusted for inflation. Inflation has been taken out. All right, real interest rate also shows a change in purchasing power of the amount, and nominal interest rate shows a change in the dollar value of the amount. Okay. Since real interest rate has inflation taken out, it's going to show how much your deposit will grow in terms of purchasing power. Okay, so let's say the bank charges you 11% on $1,000. So by the time you pay them back, let's say this is for a year, they will have $1,110. Okay, so nominally their account grew by $110. That is what nominal interest rate measures, is the growth in dollar amount. Okay, and nominal interest rate includes real interest rate plus expected inflation. So if we look at that $110, the purchasing power of that $110, okay, actually grew by $50. Okay, that's what the real interest rate says. So that $110 that the bank earned can buy $50 more worth of goods and services this year than it could last year. Okay, so you're like, wait, why doesn't it buy $110 worth more of goods and services this year than last year? And that is because prices have also risen by 6%. Okay, that's the inflation premium. So prices have also risen by 6% this year, and so it's, your $110 this year is not going to be able to buy what it could last year, but it can buy $50 more worth of goods and services this year than last year. Okay, some other issues, deflation. Now, people that are most hurt by unanticipated inflation are the ones that most benefit from deflation. So people with fixed incomes, for example, creditors as well, and savers. However, the problem with deflation too is that oftentimes eventually wages will also go down, and people are very against having their wage go down. And a lot of times there's a mixed effect. So for example, people always like their incomes to rise, but if they hold any type of fixed assets, then the values of those assets might fall. So they might enjoy an increase in income, but not so much enjoy the value of their assets falling. And if for anyone that's on a fixed rate mortgage, then their real debt declines, and that's a good position to be in. So a lot of times, inflation, deflation, it has mixed effects, not like an all or nothing. And also some arbitrariness. Basically, some people benefit at the expense of others by inflation, and so, essentially, we'll say, it lacks a social conscience. We know for sure that cost plus cost push inflation does affect output in a very negative way. Increasing input costs, then the price of the good and service increases, which law of supply and demand, and demand for that good drops. So companies reduce their output, unemployment goes up. Okay, so for demand pull inflation, economists will disagree. That's what economists do. They disagree on everything. And some economists say that zero inflation is best because that way, the cost of businesses having to change their prices, for example, are minimized. And also the time to do this is minimized, and time trying to get more information, for example, etc. But other economists say that mild inflation, is better, because that means the economy is growing, and so increased demand leads to better profits for companies. They hire more and they buy more capital goods and keep expanding. All right, so now I did say that inflation is a byproduct of a growing economy, and usually it's mild inflation, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5% a year. Now hyperinflation is very devastating to an economy. Okay, and this is when prices increase by more than 50% a month, and there have been examples of hyperinflation throughout history, and it's usually is right before an economy will collapse or right after economy collapse. So an example of hyperinflation, in Germany, okay, after the First World War, prices were increasing so much that businesses had to change their price daily, sometimes several times a day, and eventually what resulted is children began playing with the money as a toy. It was worthless. They would actually burn money instead of wood because it was cheaper to burn bills than it was to buy wood. And essentially it turned into a barter economy. Businesses don't know what to charge because inflation is increasing so rapidly and consumers don't know what to pay. And so, like I said, money becomes worthless and usually the economy turns into a barter economy. Zimbabwe has ongoing hyperinflation. You can see here 14.9 billion% in 2008. You can actually go on Amazon and buy Zimbabwean currency because it's worth so little that people try to sell it on Amazon just as a novelty. Okay, so technically we were out of the recession in June 2009. However, the drop in unemployment rate was just very, very slow. I mean, it was still hard to find jobs. The economy was growing, but at a very slow pace. Some people say it's because it's a higher federal minimum wage. If companies have to pay more, they won't hire as much. But this only makes up a small portion of the population. Other economists will say actually a higher minimum wage will help the economy because if people are earning more, then they will demand more goods and services. Also, during this tough period, Congress extended unemployment benefits, and so some people said, well, if people are getting unemployment benefits, then maybe they took their time in finding a job. Unemployment benefits in the States aren't as generous as in Europe, so there's less risk of abuse. Also, structural adjustments, just the type of workers the economy needs. So when the housing bubble collapsed, there was a lot of construction workers out of work and the economy didn't need it. Businesses weren't really expanding as much. Houses weren't being built as fast. And so a lot of times there's displaced workers. And also higher labor costs. Some people will blame Obamacare for making labor more expensive because it's not just wage that workers have to pay, but they also have to pay, for example, benefits. So there's a lot of reasons that have been pointed out to. Growth has been, back in 2013, 14, it's been good. 15 had a couple of like blips, slow periods, and we're keeping a close eye on 2016. There's a lot of world events that are occurring, plus the drop in oil prices has been good for the economy in some ways, but anyone living in Houston knows it hasn't been so great. So we'll see what direction the economy keeps moving on. All right, this concludes chapter 27.